So I'm going to speak to you about the impact of your energy and your consciousness when you're going through a spiritual awakening process. This is based on listening to about 3,000 people over the years, ever since my own initial awakening of Kundalini back when I was in graduate school. So I've done lots of research, and I've also done lots of connection with people who are in this process. I want you to really understand how Kundalini correlates with self-realization or spiritual awakening. Many people who feel an impulse for a spiritual search often don't realize that they're asking for an inner evolution, a transformation of both their consciousness and their energy. And it begins with a deconstruction process. It deconstructs the way that we see ourselves and the way that we see the world. Just like any transformation, you have to start by letting go of what's no longer needed. Of course, many people who are not spiritual seekers also fall into this experience. It's a change that can happen spontaneously, either through a practice or through other circumstances that you had no idea could trigger this kind of a movement or awakening in your body. For some people, awakening seems kind of magical, as if it's going to bring them powers and genius and abilities that were previously unknown. Some of the teachings out of India and Tibet make extravagant claims that have caused a lot of people in the West to have misconceptions about what to expect if they have an awakening. If they have a Kundalini arising, they imagine all kinds of new powers, things like that. But the great secret is that this power is actually much more subtle. It's not nearly as dramatic as the mind would have it. And it's also a potential for everyone. You don't have to be someone special for Kundalini to arise. What Kundalini brings is a great interior realization that happens almost at the cellular level of what you are, what our roots are, what we're grounded in as human beings. It's not the expansive, blissful states that you sometimes encounter along the way. You can have mystical experiences, you can have wonderful openings of bliss or insight, and that's great, but it's not the same as the awakening of consciousness to itself, as self-realization. And often when we pursue mystical experiences, we never get rid of that longing for more. There's a sense of someday I'll have this great experience and that'll end all experiences and I'll be done. And that isn't how it works at all. Spiritual awakening, when it's deep and it's deep inside of you and you recognize what you are, it gets rid of the seeker. The seeking part of you dies. You're no longer looking for the next great thing. There's a great interior sense of relaxation and peace, even though there may still be a whole lot of steps you're going to be going through before you ever find a way to live congruently from that place. So awakening is knowing what you are and annihilating the seeking. It brings freedom because you're no longer seeing the world through your personal conditioning. You're no longer stuck in a perspective and an automatic response that you have been entangled in, maybe for many lifetimes. It's as if all the baggage falls away, the baggage of your conditioning and the unconscious patterns and beliefs that you've carried, which have limited your understanding of what you and everyone else is. So it kind of opens you to a new way of seeing everything. This can be quite alarming for family and friends because you're no longer responding the way you used to. You may not feel connected in the same way anymore, and you might lose interest in a lot of the things that used to keep you distracted and entertained. Think of it. Awakening is bringing you eventually over time into a natural stillness, peace, and wisdom inside of us that has been clouded by your familial and your cultural projections. You inherited those from your family, from your school, from your community, and you've accumulated them through this lifetime and perhaps previous lifetimes. And those are the things that are confronted and recognized and that start to fall away once you're in an awakening process after an initial awakening. Awakening of either Kundalini or consciousness appears to be evolutionary because when you begin to see your personal history and recognize that it's not very relevant or it's not very personal, that it was kind of an impersonal experience that you, for some reason or another that's mysterious, seem to go through. We learn to see that your experience and your expression in the world is unique. But the consciousness and the energy that is moving through you is connected to a universal source. And this changes how you see yourself and how you see the way that the roles that you've carried in the world work, as well as it changes your capacity to be more authentic and more aligned with universal truth. It's like this universal awareness and wisdom becomes more accessible to you. You don't have a lot of control over it when it arises and when it's not there, but it's available as long as you're willing to go into stillness and silence and presence and let go of the old conditioned patterns. Self-realization is a radical shift in how we understand who we are and how our existence coalesces with all of planetary existence and the underlying consciousness that enlivens all of us. It's a radical shift in our consciousness and how we perceive the world, basically. And it's supported by changes in the subtle energy field, which have been called in the East Kundalini. Kundalini means coiled. The idea they have in the Indian science of Kundalini is that when a baby is conceived, energy enters the egg and the fetus grows into a baby. And after you're completely formed as a baby, the residual energy coils at the base of the spine and holds your basic energy field in stasis until you die. And then when you die, the energy unravels and leaves the body and merges back again with universal energies. So in yoga and also in Qigong and in other energy systems about the world and in indigenous cultures even, ways were discovered to activate this energy without having to die, bringing it up through the body. What happens when that happens is that it intensifies the way your energy is feeling in your body. It can be extremely wired, extremely intense. It can open in three different ways, generally, the yogis will say. It can be very gradual, so you hardly notice it. It's maybe opens one chakra area at a time over a period of time. Or it can be kind of a moderate awakening, so it feels kind of like a snake or something moving through your body and you notice it all at once moving through. Or it can be extremely explosive like a geyser and you just feel blown away as if this could kill you. And there's no predicting of why or how it would activate in one person or another. What I've learned is there's thousands of different ways that people activate and move into this energy flow. And there's a lot of different ways that we're impacted by it, depending a great deal on your conditioning. Because if you think of it as a deconstruction process, you understand that everything that's unfinished business in your psyche is going to come to the surface. And you have to face it. You have to meet it. You have to come to terms with it so that it can be released. And so if you've had very difficult history, or you've had a lot of toxins in your system from the way you've lived, or you're under a lot of stress in your life, you may have more difficulty with Kundalini because it's working so hard to release all of that out of the energy flow in your body. In addition, the Kundalini is transforming you a little bit at a time, so you can go through a lot of emotional and psychological changes and not understand where they're coming from. And unfortunately, even in spiritual systems as well as medical systems, there are not a lot of people that have seen enough range of this phenomena to be able to recognize it. And often people are discouraged or even turned away from their spiritual communities because they're expressing too much psychological upheaval or too much energetic upheaval, or just because there's no paradigm whatsoever in the system they're in to explain how energy is an associate, you could say, of consciousness, how energy and consciousness work together. And if one is going to transform, so must the other. For centuries, the awakening of Kundalini energy was considered a secret method for reaching enlightenment. And those who practiced it tended to stay in isolation, kind of going into trances where they feel connected to another dimension and freed from worldly distractions. So they might have been in an ashram setting or even a cave. They might have been isolated from everybody else. And they might have had a guide who had at least some understanding that they were going through a major transformational process. But this wasn't ever considered at that time that something that would happen to someone who was uninitiated in those particular systems. But today, many people are opening this energy without the structure and containment of a training or an ashram setting, nor the guidance of someone who knows the optimal methods and pathways for the experience. Those have kind of been lost in the esoteric teachings, which were designed for common understanding. So people are awakening through energy or yoga practices, qigong, meditation in many traditions that are not familiar with Kundalini, or as a consequence of deep spiritual devotion, a desire to know truth, a desire to understand it all, a desire to escape the limitations someone is feeling in their life. Or they can even awaken because of a great trauma or grief or an injury to their body that's very intense, particularly if it hits the spine. They can awaken because of a connection with somebody else whose energy is very awake. And all of this can happen without any knowledge whatsoever that you're an energy field, that there is such a thing as spiritual awakening, that transformation or evolution is a potential. And so people get very frightened sometimes when this happens. And even if they've researched it and have some understanding themselves, if their family doesn't have that experience, they might be very frightened for them. So sometimes family and friends guide you into treatments that are not supportive of the process. So people have called me from all over the world who are going into these processes, both spontaneously and in spiritual settings where nobody knows really what's happening to them and nobody can offer any suggestions. And the books I've written are about these people, and they're about ways for you to come into context with the energy. And you can't make it stop. You can't make it go away, but you can come in right relationship with it. So there's a cooperative relationship that allows it to evolve in the most optimal ways. So many people, they're awakening in the midst of everyday lives in countries all over the world. And they don't know what's happening to them because of this lack of preparation and understanding. If you happen to have a teacher it's never happened to, they aren't going to be able to relate to it. So evolution, it might be a natural process, but that doesn't mean it's an easy one. And evolving into a more conscious way of being involves stripping away old ways in order to make room for the new. I'm sure that even the first fish who came out of the water and went onto land must have had many challenges and doubts and anxieties as they tried to adjust and into becoming another species. And in some ways, that's what we're doing. We're trying to become a more conscious, present, authentic species of human. So those who are awakening are coming out of patterns, who they believed they used to be, who they thought they were, and discovering they're now in the unknown. They're in an unknown potential. And many of your old patterns and beliefs no longer fit. And the people around you do not share these new paradigms that you're finding, you're discovering inside yourself. And so they can feel very alarmed and, in a very loving way, have great concern about you. There's so many mythologies about enlightenment that most people don't think it's even a possibility for them. The mythologies contradict the direct experience. Most teachers will say that you can't, it's indescribable. You can't really describe it, which leaves a lot of room for the mystery and the projections. But most of what is known comes from ancient texts, and these apply to different times and different cultures and different lifestyles. And so there can always be kind of a magical tone, especially 300 or 400 years afterwards, in describing the wisdom or the possibilities or the powers of an enlightened person. So what Kundalini activation is actually doing is it's stripping away everything in you that is not enlightened already. In other words, it's bringing you down to a very simple presence of just being able to live here and now in this moment without all the baggage of your history and all the belief systems of your culture and all the ways in which our mind limits us and criticizes us and others and judges us and causes us to hold back from expressing our authentic intuitions and understandings of one another. It deconstructs our former assumptions and it breaks the barriers of consciousness so that we might have moments of falling into an altered state of reality at times, or we might at times feel bliss in our bodies. It's as if the cells light up and you can feel bliss occasionally. You might suddenly or occasionally have a revelation of some deep truth that seems to be meaningful to you. You also might have revelations of your shadow material. You might suddenly see your own darkness, and because you've had it repressed all your life and you just don't want to acknowledge that part of yourself. In a way, it lays bare every part of us. And so therefore, we have to find this inner intuitive strength to meet whatever arises. In a way, we're becoming more whole, more inclusive of the entire humanity. Because from that more inclusive place, we have much more capacity to be of service. Kundalini awakening can also enhance creativity, or it can bring you some new form of self-expression that might surprise you. It's very helpful in the process to find some new ways to express creativity. Maybe to explore painting some of those things that you can't describe, or writing music or dancing movement. It's very useful to express, to find your unique way of expressing. It also, in time, will bring you into deeper stillness and peace. It's about finding that still point inside of the middle of all of this activity. You know, you may be having a lot of energetic releases, a lot of mental activity, and it's so useful to learn to bring yourself into stillness, to find some point below the neck, deep in your body, that's your still point, that's your presence. And from that place, you eventually find an ability to witness all the non-ordinary experiences that are arising and meet them with equanimity. And as that happens, the whole process will settle down and you'll begin to find your own authentic connection with what's right for you, your right movement in the world. Because Kundalini and spiritual awakening and self-realization, they're not about escaping the world. They may seem that way because at first the teachings kind of get you to move into a more expansive place that doesn't feel so embodied, that feels like more like the sky, like the consciousness that has no boundaries. And so you're learning that you are that. But in addition to that, that unique, vast, beautiful consciousness is contained in this little form that you are. And this little form is unique in its expression. So being authentic is almost demanded in this process. If you don't listen to what's authentic and follow the core of what's right for you, you're going to be unhappy. You're going to feel trapped. You're going to feel divided. And many of us are living adaptations in the roles in our lives of things that don't really fit for us. So we have to listen much more deeply to ourselves if we're in a spiritual awakening process. That doesn't mean that you don't address the direct needs in your life. What I've found is one of my beliefs that most of my students have often heard me say is that if something lands on your doorstep, it belongs to you. So that doesn't mean you can escape the responsibility of meeting your children's needs or finding work if you need to support yourself or your family. But it means you have to find the most authentic way. Freedom isn't freedom just to do whatever you want. Freedom is freedom to do what's needed in the moment, both for your own well-being and for that of others. So this whole awakening process is ever unfolding. It's not something that you're going to reach some final exit point and you'll be perfect. There's no perfection in this. There's just a continual unfolding of life and of noticing what's needed next, and of returning when you can to that stillness inside of you, which becomes like a place to marinate in truth, a place to seek truth, a place to nurture yourself, just as a deep sleep is a nurturing for the body mind. So is returning to the inner stillness through meditation or through walking in nature and connecting here and now with what's there, with the trees, with the water, with the flowers. It's not easy for people to reorient their life for what's really good for them and good for others or good for their family if they need to do that. Because we're so used to functioning from an unconscious point of view, from letting our unconscious guide us, our impulses, our old patterns that often we learned very, very young as a way of defending ourselves in the world. And then we often are in an environment that has a collective agreement about what's important. And suddenly we don't fit in anymore. And that can be very hard to adjust. Excuse me. So very often, even though you've had an awakening, or even though you've experienced bliss in Kundalini at times, you're going to have moments of anxiety because things are changing so rapidly inside of you. Or you may have moments of depression because you no longer love the activities you used to love, and you begin to suspect that you're not who you identified with being, that your identifications or your attachments to those things fall away. It's not that you don't remember who you've been or the skills you've had. It's that they seem to feel irrelevant, that there's nobody there anymore who really cares, because those things are fading out of your psyche to make room for another kind of awareness that's much more immediate and lives much more in the moment. And so you can imagine that the more you resist and get angry and feel afraid, the more difficult this might be for you, because the more you can align yourself with truth, with love for yourself, for others, for the world, and simply be curious about what's going on, be curious about the unusual energies, be curious about the mood shifts, be curious about a sudden psychic opening, or hearing. Sometimes people have unusual experiences like hearing music, hearing sound, and just to be curious and hold it as part of the mystery, rather than thinking that it means that you're crazy or you're falling apart or you're not able to function, because you want to develop kind of a cooperative relationship with this enhanced energy field that's trying to move through your body and help you in your quest for truth and self-realization. This is what evolving through those who are tapped for awakening looks like. It's all of these changes. And probably it's happening because it's the next order of development in our species. All of you who have felt despair at some of the conditions in our world are not alone. I mean, if you look back historically, there has always been extremely challenging problems going on in the culture and in the species. And this is a great opportunity to be in the forefront of a transformation that isn't really for yourself. It's partly for yourself, you feel that, but it's actually for the collective, because the things that you face and release go out of the mind field, they go out of the collective, they don't come back. You're clearing out that little piece. So if you've had a terrible history, or you're from a lineage of a family with great difficulties, you're breaking that lineage. You're freeing not just yourself, you're freeing a whole line of, you could say, dysfunction in the species, in the mind of the species. Until you face your darkness and claim your light, you can't bring radical new possibilities that are needed in our world at this time. So if your energy is awakening, it's inviting you to know your true nature, your connection with truth, and to free yourself of your conditioning. And it doesn't strip you so much as inform you by insight, by step of what you need to let go of. And when you do not let go, you're going to feel the discomfort. And that's where the conflicts come in this process. It's when the mind steps in and says, oh, no, I can't release that, or I can't change that. Or it's not safe to move into a new career path, or I'm in this toxic relationship, but I can't let it go. You have to take care of yourself in this process, and you have to meet the things that arise that are teaching you what you need, what's good for you, and therefore what's going to be good for this process. For awakening to flow smoothly, there needs to be a continuous willingness to take the next step, to respond with an open heart and an open mind, and to manage the dysfunctional aspects of yourself in new and creative ways, rather than letting them bog you down. As Kundalini moves through, it's going to reveal our stuck places, and we need to meet and address them, whether they be physical or psychological. We gradually learn the truth of what we are, and new potentials will arise. We're part of a process, both physical and planetary. But we're not in control of it. All we can do is relax, center ourselves, and get into right relationship with it. And the more we can do that, the more it comes into harmony, the more our natural energy flow becomes harmonious and balanced. Kundalini has this science, based on what ancient people have experienced or discovered. And this model can help us a bit, but it's not rational and predictable. So no one can tell you that if you experience this today, you're going to experience that tomorrow. Nobody can tell you how long you'll be in the process. As Adyashanti, a prominent non-dual teacher, has said many times, God can do this any way it wants. And anyone who's worked with a wide variety of experiencers sees clearly the multiplicity of ways in which this opens us and transforms us. There's no one way. Energy can open gradually, moderately, or explosively, as I mentioned. I'm going to talk just a little bit about what I've observed over the years listening to people in the process, the different categories of phenomena that arise. And I know it's frustrating that psychologists and doctors don't understand this model. They've never been exposed to this paradigm. They can only apply the paradigm they've learned. But there are more and more people who are doctors and psychologists who are having their own awakenings, or who practice meditation, Buddhist practices, and understand a lot more about energy flow. And it's really useful to look for those people if you feel you're in a Kundalini process, to keep searching till you find somebody that has some familiarity with it. Generally, there's an initial experience, and that can be pretty dramatic, and it often happens in a meditation setting, just this huge movement and arising of energy. But sometimes it happens just laying in bed at night or walking down the street. Usually happens to people that have a history of doing energy work of some sort, even martial arts, qigong, yoga, or people who have longed all their childhood and life to know what's this all about? What's true? So they've had this desire, this hunger, even though they haven't identified it. So after this initial opening, there's usually a long period that can last for years of energetic releasing. It may be more intense the first few months, and the body may shake and jerk. You may wake up at night with vibrations, heat, shaking, tingling. If you have some kind of an area of your body that's got a damage or a wound, it may concentrate in that area. You may have involuntary jerking or movements, or even involuntarily find yourself going into yoga poses that you don't even know. You've never even tried yoga. You can also have a lot of inner sensations, like itching or vibrating or tingling. You might have a psychic opening, and it can be temporary. It may be you suddenly have a psychic vision of something that happens a little bit later in the family, or you may have a sudden ability to heal. These kinds of cities, as they're called, are not common. They come to some people, but they're not something to expect. And they're not something you really have to do anything about. It's better to wait until your process matures and you can really connect with your authentic expression and know what's right movement for you in the world, what's going to be your unique contribution. And sometimes you have to go through kind of a long period of emptiness before that arises for you. And emptiness is another category of phenomena. Emptiness, stillness, feeling you've fallen into an abyss, or even darkness. It can feel like that to the mind, but those are actually invitations into what's called the numinous dark, or the numinous light, or the ground of being. So it's like there's at some point you will find a willingness to let yourself become that. Let yourself rest in that, and it will show you the pregnant potentiality of the universe. Basically, everything is arising from this source. So this is part of the awakening process, and not a failing or a problem in your life. It's a well-documented opportunity for self-realization. There can also be many psychological shifts. Most common is the loss of drive, mood swings, a sense of being no one, or losing interest in your identifications. And as I mentioned earlier, the anxiety and the depression. You can also have physical issues such as heightened sensitivity, heat, feeling the brain or the body is being worked over. And you can have these spiritual shifts to unitive consciousness. Changing your worldview is likely to change. You may suddenly feel compulsive love or compassion that doesn't even feel personal, it's just arising. You may need to give up toxins, toxic relationships, drugs, alcohol, activities that seem inauthentic. So this is a lot to move through, and it's part of becoming more whole. And you're going to learn to live in two worlds if you're in this process and you meet it fully. Remember, this is ultimately about a shift in perspective, a profound relaxation into life, as well as the expansiveness of no boundary, and a willingness to accept the nature both of life and of death. It's not an escape from either. And in time, it reshapes the mind and the heart. And hopefully, it may someday reshape the interactions and the understandings of the human species and how we live with one another. So I wish you every blessing on this challenging journey. Whether or not you have chosen it, it has chosen you. And I hope you'll look for my books and also give them to your doctors and teachers. The newest one is When Spirit Leaps, Navigating the Process of Spiritual Awakening. There's a lot of guidance in it and a lot of understanding of how this process looks in various people. I also have two websites. One is called KundaliniGuide.com. The other is called AwakeningGuide.com. And they're full of information and essays that were written to help you understand what you're experiencing. So thank you.